Hi and welcome to Thete Gaming. So, in lieu of actually playing a battle with the new Thousand Suns this week, most unfortunate, I'm going to be discussing my immediate thoughts on the new codex. They will be featuring next week. I'm going to get my arse handed to me by them next week. But problems this week means no battle, so everything's delayed a week. But what I'm going to discuss are the basic strengths of the new Thousand Suns in the battle itself, but also how one particular element of their new rules is, I think, perhaps maybe a little strong. Not what would immediately come to mind though, at least not directly. Obviously the main strength of Thousand Suns is the psychic phase. You expect that, that's what they're set up for. Basically almost everything in the army is a psyker. Very much like the Grey Knights that came out at the same time. So you obviously know you're going to need to make your gains in the psychic phase. You need to have a good psychic phase. Of course, Thousand Suns is stronger than Grey Knights with, if nothing else, their Cabal points rolled, because it means that you can't really have a bad psychic phase. It's less swingy. It's much more reliable. You know, for those who don't know, you get a pool of Cabal points in your psychic phase as Thousand Suns, depending on what units you've taken, which can be used for some very tasty little tricks, like you could add 1 to your psychic test, you could add 2 to your psychic test, and you can do that after you roll. You don't have to think, oh, this is really important, I'll spend the Cabal. You can just roll, see what you get. Go, oh, I've got an 11, that'll do. Or you can go, oh, I could do with adding 2. I've got the Cabal points to do it, this is important, I'm going to do that. Can be done after you roll. Again, reduces variation, reduces swinginess, increases reliability. You can even use it to auto-pass a psychic test. Useful if you've ramped up your smite and you're thinking it's a bit high now, I'm probably not going to pass this one. I'll just spend the Cabal points to make it auto pass. Several nice abilities, very nice abilities, that along with the natural +1 to psychic tests, means that you're going to have a dominant time in the psychic phase. Now this helps Thousand Suns become very powerful against many armies. Obviously, mortal wounds bypass a lot of core mechanics in the game. So, like an extreme example, if you consider Death Guard. Death Guard, very solid. And when it came out, people were, oh, this is too strong, too strong. Obviously, it's one of the early codices, 9th edition. Other ones have come out. It's not been left behind. It's still solid, but it's not in the top tier anymore. But its big strength is resilience. It's got a few nice features to it, but its big strength is resilience, if you'll pardon the expression. So your core units, Plague Marines and Terminators especially, but a few other things. Basically, you've got a good save. They're all high toughness, you know, Space Marines and Terminators toughness 5. You've got invulnerable saves on a lot of common units, and your Terminators 4 up invulnerable save. They reduce damage by 1. Quite a lot of the units you'll take reduce damage by 1. And that all makes for an army that can be a brick wall against a lot of the sort of attacks that are common in 40k. And all of those strengths are useless against mortal wounds. The toughness, the save, the invulnerable save, the reducing damage does nothing against mortal wounds. So when you have an army that can deal the sheer level of mortal wound barrage that Thousand Suns has, you're obviously going to be in a bad time. It's like a paper, rock, scissors thing, isn't it? My great strength is being able to take a hit to the face. Oh, I've got mortal wounds. Okay. You know, and you do get that in games like this paper, rock, scissors element to it. But, you know, you can weather the storm, and how is everything else? Well, the shooting isn't going to feature in the top tier compared to some armies. You certainly wouldn't put it as, oh, absolutely fantastic shooting army. But it's not bad. A unit of 10 Rubric Marines with Warp Flamers, D6 automatic hits, Strength 4, -2 AP. That's going to ruin someone's day. And you can say, well, you know, Flamer, 12-inch range, you march it up the board and it'll get shot away. You don't march it up the board. You know, you can guarantee delivery onto the very edge of your opponent's army in turn 1, no matter how they've deployed. If you want, you've got different options for it. It's not just the teleport option, you've got different options to do that. So after a devastating psychic phase, which will include some interesting buffs as well as mortal, it's not just about the mortal wounds. You've got some very nice things you can buff your units up with. You can, depending on how your army's built, be left facing a not inconsiderable amount of armor sapping shooting, because -2 AP is not just for the flamers. That's the standard weapons of the Rubric Marines, of the Scarab Occult Terminators. In the fight phase, I would say, I mean, they're hardly useless, but they're not potent, you know, compared with other armies. I think this is where the Grey Knights would draw level, because at this point you'd be thinking, well, Grey Knights are, of course, a good foil to the Thousand Sons with their +1. I mean, they've got lots of things that can deny, get the right game, and they get +1 to it. Nice little foil. Obviously, Thousand Sons have a few little tricks to sort of bung it up a bit more. So they're still going to have a dominant time there, but, you know, Grey Knights will do as well as anyone in stopping it. Shooting, Grey Knights isn't amazing shooting, but in combat, yeah, they're better. They're clearly better. So yeah, but you have an army that can deal with tanks in the psychic phase very reliably with Thousand Sons. It's like, oh, you've got a lot of wounds, or you've got high armor save, or you've got an invulnerable save, which, no, I'm just going to do mortal wounds at you. And then whatever pops out of their smoking remains in the shooting phase, you can deal with that. And it's also reasonably resilient itself. It's not like glass cannon. Nothing like on the level of something like Death Guard, obviously. But, you know, +1 save on units, you know, again, your Marines and your Terminators, against one single damage attacks. Immunity to morale. I mean, all makes them a little harder to shift off the objectives, as well as, of course, Rupert Marines, like other Space Marines, now having 2 wounds, their Terminators 3 wounds, all makes them difficult to shift. And it all makes them an army that you can build a nice list with and compete against a lot of other armies. But that's always been the case, you know, or you know, has been the case for, you know, the time I've been interested in 40k, because there have been gaps. But they've always been competitive. And when I say competitive, I mean you can win tournaments with them. And I think a big part of that is the way they sit on the edge of the core rules. Like, now, if you look at Knights, Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, I think they struggle sometimes. I mean, you can still win with them. But they struggle sometimes because they don't really fit with the way 40k works. You know, they struggle to get victory points because it's just an army that just goes, you know what, massive bombardment, but they're not scoring victory points. They don't have the board presence for the primaries very easily, and it's not easy to pick up the secondaries even either. And for Games Workshop to fix that, what they'd have to do with a new codex is to bring in a load of rules that basically break the mechanics of the game. That say, you ignore all these basic core mechanics of the game. So they'll never sit right. Whereas Thousand Sons works against armies that are set up to withstand the sort of punishment that most armies are designed to deliver. And none of that defense works against mortal wounds. So someone is paying a points premium for their units to be able to withstand the usual pressure. Doesn't work against mortal wounds. So effectively their army is smaller, because you add up all the points they've spent on defences that just don't work against Thousand Sons, and all of a sudden that's a good chunk of your points just thrown in the bin. Added on to that, the fact that they have an easier time reliably casting those psychic powers with their +1 bonus, careful use of Cabal points, as well as handy stratagems, and they're an absolutely fantastic foil to the standard list. But that's not where I think their greatest strength lies, although it is brutal. For me, where it sort of tips it a bit is in the secondaries, the secondary objectives. Now, with the new codices, of which we have a fair few now, so we can really compare them, there are some that have some great choices. It's like in any given game, there's some armies where it's like, which of these secondaries am I going to pick? Because I'm definitely going to pick one of them because they're all quite good. You know, different situations demand different ones. And then you've got others like Necrons or Adeptus Sororitas, where they're interesting, but they're incredibly niche. You know, you could easily find yourself in quite a lot of games going, well, none of them are really that great to take here. And you could find yourself picking 3 from the common list. So Thousand Sons, first of all, gets 4 choices. Not everyone does. Some just get 3. So that's more than some. And they're really good. But I want to point out a few. I'll leave what I think is the almost auto pick until second vote, because the other one is more to commiserate with Grey Knights players. So there's a shadow operation secondary called Burn Empires. It's an action, of course. End of the movement phase. You basically burn an objective. You don't remove it. You're not removing it. You're just burning it. It's just a thing. You're marking it. The action is completed at the end of your next command phase. So it's not the end of your turn. It does give your opponent some chance to ruin it. And it can't be done on an objective in your own deployment zone. So it's not as straightforward as some other similar ones. But you can carry out multiples of that action in any given turn. And it's worth 4 victory points each. So even if you just manage to do it in like in one turn, for example, you get to the... I mean, different missions have different battle, but quite often there's a couple in no man's land. Not always, but there's a couple sometimes. You could just rush to those, carry out that action there, and you get 8 victory points. As long as those units are still around at the end of your next command phase, which, you know, as I say, they're not easy to shift. Then you've got another one similar, but it's a psychic action this time. And again, you can do this to objectives, but there's no restriction on where they can be. They can be anywhere. And you can only do one of these per turn. That's more normal. And it starts off with Warp Charge 4, and it increases by 1 each time you do it, I think. So it can ramp up a bit. But it's worth 3 victory points each time. And remember, there are ways of making psychic tests with Cabal points much more reliable. So that may or may not sound fine, but against someone with, say, no Psyker, that... for me, would be one I'd go, yeah, I'll have that. And you can look at those and you think, oh, that sounds all right, but what's the issue? I mean, you'd use it in this situation, not this, blah, blah, blah. Well, pity the poor Grey Knights, because they get a psychic action equivalent that is insane. Warp charge 5, but it stays at that level. There's no limits to how many you can... You're purifying the objectives here. There's no limits to how many you can do a turn, either. You could just... If you're on all 6, you could do all 6. Other than the usual proviso of no enemies in range of it. And it is an action, so again, stops you casting something else as well. I mean, something else that Thousand Suns can sort of sneak. If they've got someone who can do 2 psychic abilities, there is a way of doing a psychic action and still getting to do a psychic power. But, never mind. You'd often do it with ones who can only cast 1 anyway, it doesn't matter. But it's not a case of points per objective purified. It's a tally. Oh, that's okay. You do get tallies sometimes with secondary. Yeah, but listen to this. If you burn 1 objective, or purify, sorry, this time, 1 in Holy Fire, so you're still burning it. In one, you do 1 objective, you get 1 victory point. If you do 2, you get 2 victory points. Oh, so it's only 1 per... Okay, that's not good. If you do 3, you get 4 victory points. And if you do 4 or more, you get 6. Well, you're not like to do 4 in any one turn. But mathematically, the most you could get from this, unless I'm missing something, is 8 victory points. So you could do 3 in one turn and 3 another. And that's purifying all 6 objectives in the game. And not all missions have 6, but obviously you couldn't choose it for that. I mean, you think about it, you'd have to purify... Not only do you have to purify every objective on the battlefield, but you'd have to do it 3 at a time, at least 3 at a time in the same phase, having to cast that... achieve the warp charge requirement, not fail any of them. You know, what? And the best you could get is 8 victory points. I'm not going to go into all the details anymore, but it's very boring. But that's a truly epic feat of board control and psychic control, and you'd still only get 8 victory points. In a tight game, you'd do well to get 4 victory points out of that secondary, and I think that would be a push. Basically, I'd faint dead on the spot if I ever see anyone taking this in a tournament and winning a game. But the one that really makes Thousand Suns powerful, because the other ones are useful if you can't use this. All right? You wouldn't take the other ones but for this. It's a secondary called Wrath of Magnus. It might well be called Give Yourself 15 Victory Points, son. The proviso is that the opposing army must have at least 1 Psyker, or you can't take it. But how it works is, at the end of the battle round, you get it at the end of the battle round, if the Thousand Suns army kills more models in the psychic phase than their opponent does in theirs, they get 3 victory points. Now, I guess you could try and deploy all the way back in the hopes of preventing the Thousand Suns player getting any offensive psychic powers off at all in the first battle round, then limiting them to 12 victory points. But seriously, how would you ever compete with a Thousand Suns army on models killed in the psychic phase? Particularly now. +1 for your psychic powers, for your tests, Cabal points to make them more reliable. How are you going to, with the sheer number going out, how are you going to compete with that? You're not. I mean, the extreme case is a Space Marines army with a librarian. They might as well give up. But so too might anything else. Craft World's Harlequins, they put a lot of emphasis on their psychic phase. They're not capable of the level of mortal wounds in a Thousand Suns army. You know, I wouldn't even fancy the chances of Grey Knights on this one. You could argue that it forces the Thousand Suns player to make sure because what they'd like to do, if a lot against tank, is focus on the tank stuff. But it's like, well, I need to make sure because if you do you might do a smite at me and plink off some Sangors or something. I better make sure I at least do kill more than you. So it keeps them a bit honest that they have to plink off some infantry, not just focus on the big stuff. So yeah, there is that. So, but you have so much psychic flying around, and it's not like, because Grey Knights will have a lot of psychic as well, but a lot of theirs, they have got offensive stuff, but a lot of it is buffing. Whereas Thousand Suns, they have got buff stuff as well, but there's so many just do mortal wounds stuff as well. That's surely going to be an auto take in almost all games where you can take it. Like, for me, the secondaries in the codices are really important for that army-specific flavour. It's really, it's good that they have that. And I know it's a bit awkward because it's always going to be an issue then of balance, because some armies, they'll produce ones that are really strong and some they won't. It's just giving the game's producers another opportunity to maybe make some armies stronger than others. But it is really important to have that flavour. But it's disappointing when you don't feel that any are suitable for a particular game for some armies. But I don't think that's the sign of a poorly designed secondary. I think the sign of a poorly designed secondary is less, I'd never really take this, like the Grey Knights one I described, and more, I'd always take this. But this is one where you can get an almost guaranteed at least 12 victory points from it as well. Probably 15, because some Thousand Suns armies will not care where you deploy. And if they have to go first, they'll just go, I'm just going to teleport something in here then. And, and they'll get to something. So yeah, I think an army with a lot of interesting abilities, a lot of powerful abilities. Definitely a strong army. I'm not qualified to say, it's definitely going to be up there with like Drukhari, but could very well be. Although actually, ironically, they may not fancy facing a Drukhari army. That, there could be a nice little foil against them there. But it could be quite interesting actually, Drukhari against Thousand Suns. I'll have to do that sometime. Got a Drukhari coming on the way. Might be a while yet though. But, there are strong armies. It's one of the strong armies, definitely. And I was discussing this at the local club, and I'd certainly agree it's not stronger than Drukhari or Admech. I wouldn't say, this is now the strong army. The power creep has come. It's the latest codex. It's the most powerful. Because that's certainly not the case with, like, Grey Knights. And it can have the same issues with those two armies as balance as well. Because just like Drukhari and Admech, now they've both received nerfs since release, which toned them down in the areas they needed toning down. But it still doesn't stop them being the strongest armies. Because they're I say the strongest. You could make some very nasty Space Marines one, I suppose, as well. But it didn't stop them being strong because their strength is a core part of the design of the armies. You can change stratagems as they did for Admech. You could fiddle with points values as they did for Drukhari, but it's just a core feature of that army. I think same with Thousand Suns. The game just sets up certain parameters that some armies will be able to exploit better than others. But that secondary for me is where I do have very genuine criticism. I mean, actions can sometimes look strong. Action secondaries can sometimes look strong, but you have to remember there's a trade-off with them. Though you compare the Thousand Suns ones with a Grey Knight equivalent, and you can't fail to have to scratch your head a bit and feel sorry for the Grey Knights. But the Wrath of Magnus, for me, I just don't think it should be there. It would be like giving Necrons a secondary where you get 3 victory points if you bring more models back with reanimation protocols. Which you probably won't be doing a lot of against Thousand Suns because that won't work in the psychic phase. But, that's the thing. It's a bit like, right. But aside from an easy pick for one of the secondaries, there is, as I say, I'm not ignoring the trade-off that there is in that if you just use your psychic abilities to focus down the big stuff, you may run the risk of not getting it. But even then, like, you would do that in a turn, wouldn't you, anyway? Because even getting 12 victory points for a secondary would be really good. So you would sacrifice a turn of psychic to take out the big stuff, and then from there on, plick off the infantry and take it on anyway. So I don't think that's much of a trade-off. But aside from an easy pick from the secondaries, we are going to see what they're like next week. I actually really wanted to use the Ebon Chalice Adeptus Sororitas against them. You know, since I got my Adeptus Sororitas army, I've been like, want to do it against a psychic heavy army and you know, use their kill the witches type thing. So I've been looking forward to having an abhor the witch type game for my sisters, basically. But I've got a load of Nurgle demons and I haven't played them in 40k, and I've got other things coming online soon. So it's going to be it would have been Nurgle Demons against Thousand Suns next week. Sorry, it wasn't this week. Unavoidable. Until then, I hope you found the video interesting. Let me know where you agree and disagree in the comments below. And until next time, I'll see you later.